Hello and welcome wherever you're listening to and watching 2020 Coaching Convos, as usual with me, Julie Crabb. So again, you've joined me on the second series, and which I've called Passionately Curious. And this is in which I explore questions and ideas about the language and jargon of coaching. So as the title strongly suggests, I'm simply curious and I want clearer and deeper understanding for myself and hopefully for you and others about coaching language. And that's to reflect on and make sense of what I've been taught and what I've learnt and what I've adopted as a coach. And importantly to me, and the original purpose of this podcast and podcast, to ensure that coaching is available to all who want to make use of it. So if you haven't yet heard the first week's introductory episode, which is audio only and on Spotify, I'd really encourage you to go back and just take the 5 minutes it takes to hear more about the background to this episode and series, so where it all started. So in episode 2 last week, I pretty much sat on the verge of the path in the metaphorical labyrinth of series 2. And in the episode, if you watched it, I shared the responses of 2 fellow coaches, Max Kemp and Nandini Balakumar, who had previously guested on Coaching Uncovered, which is the audio Spotify series 1 of 2020 Coaching Convos. And out of their valuable contributions came 3 questions where there was some divergence in their views and on which I've had some really interesting replies. And I will return to those next week. But first up, I just want to share something that a fellow coach sent to me, Sharon Arnott, and she posted this in response to episode 1. She says, "Thank you for a wonderful and informative session, Julie. While I believe that professionals in general rely on jargon as a form of shortcutting and community building, the jargon used by some coaches does have the potential to make coaching less accessible and potentially exclusive." She says, "Looking forward to hearing how to find the right balance, which can go some way to ensuring the profession is more accessible. Thank you." Yeah, finding the right balance, Sharon, will definitely be the topic of a future episode in this series. There's no doubt about that. This week, I'm going to chunk down, as we say in NLP terminology, which basically means to bring the focus to a higher level of detail. And I'm going to chunk down to meander down a particular path in this maze and explore some very specific terminology or phrases used by coaches in coaching. Just by the by, whatever does that mean? Actually, I've become acutely aware over the past couple of weeks of my own turns of phrase too. So yes, just by the by, last week in a yoga session I attended, the teacher Chris reminded us to think of our why ahead of starting the class. So why are you here? And how are you planning to benefit? And I've heard of find your why in the biggest sort of perspective of life, but I hadn't thought of applying it to smaller, more kind of focal activities. So here's my why for the podcast this week. So my intention in looking at 3 particular phrases in coaching is really to review the language as objectively as I possibly can. And then my purpose is to really get some clarity and access to the meaning in the kind of universal way that Nandini mentioned last week. I also want to first note that I really recognise that each of us has a preference for a representation system. So that's the way that we each prefer to take in and provide information in our communication. So we each might be more visual, auditory, kinesthetic, so that's tactile. So this and the way that we select and collect information and build our generalizations, of course, impacts our individual response to language use. And you'll see this, you'll feel this in the way that I respond to some of the language later on. So part of rapport building with clients in coaching involves recognition of the client's sensory preference and then using language that we know is congruent with that person's representation system. So if I'm strongly visual in the way I see things when I'm understanding, I'll likely engage less well with auditory language. So when a coach says, for example, I hear what you're saying, or what I'm hearing is. So this is where I believe it is really important to pay attention to listen to, and make use of the client's own language patterns. It also occurred to me that clients are not always comfortable, especially in the early stages of coaching or in the coaching relationship, to question or check back understanding with their coach. And I will talk about this much later on, but it can, of course, be addressed through the early contracting between the client and the coach. And we'll come to these kind of suggested solutions and recommendations in a later episode. So anyone who knows me will tell you that I love a bit of structure. So I've decided to look at each phrase, each of the 3 phrases, in the same way. So I'm looking at context, so the situations in which I've heard the phrase being used, or I might use it myself. I'm looking at meaning, so what I understand the phrase to mean or what it could mean. I'm looking at what I've called amber flags rather than red or angry dangerous flags. I'm looking at amber flags, which I'm saying might be potential problems with using the phrase, so how it might otherwise be interpreted or understood. I'm looking also at possible alternatives, so how that might be said in a different way, but yet would achieve the same kind of meaning in the context. Now, in addition, I've asked a few contacts on LinkedIn who aren't receiving coaching at the moment how they respond to the phrases. So that will be an interesting objective reflection. And I can also share what ChatGPT has to say about their meaning. And I found this quite informative and interesting. So I guess just again, the phrases that a coach might use with the client that we're going to focus on are, I'm curious about, showing up, and holding space for. So let's start with I'm curious about. So if we start first with the context, so in my experience or in my use of it, I have heard it used where it's helpful for the client to expand on what they've said. So kind of inviting the client to say more. It's also used to kind of direct attention to something that the coach has noticed or observed that they might intuitively believe would be valuable to explore. So that's context. In terms of meaning, my understanding of the meaning of it is, this thing you said has attracted my attention as a coach, and I want to understand it better with you. It did occur to me that the word curious could be interpreted to signal something that's a bit unusual, sort of unusual qualities, so a bit out of the ordinary. Amber flags. It did make me think, could it potentially be experienced as nosy? So I'm curious about. Nosy or a little bit intense, a little bit odd. It depends on how you say it, of course. So if I'm curious about is directed by our interests as a coach, we have to be very careful that it's truly an objective curiosity and it's not something that's kind of aligned or in affinity with our own interests. Alternatives. So as an alternative, a coach might say simply, I'm interested in, or I'd love to know more about, or that's interesting. Can you tell me more? Or I'd like to know more about. They might also notice something or say something like, excuse me. They might also say, I notice that you did or said this. What can you say more? Or can you say more? Or what more can you say about that? And the coach might preface, as I do, or kind of contract with the client about what's called agreed levels of permission. That's so the coach knows how that person wants to be coached, and particularly in this instance, whether they're happy for the coach to make these observations. And as we'll hear later, with some of the observations from non-coaches, paralanguage is really critical. So how we say things is, of course, important, including tonality. So comments. One person said, I really don't mind the first one. It very much depends on how it's said. Another person said, I love a bit of curiosity. It's a nice phrase. It's non-judgmental. And a third person said, sorry, I don't like that term. I think it sounds a bit patronizing, but I accept it might not sound like that in reality. So yes, there's a difference between reading it in black and white and hearing it in the right tone. Now hear this about what AI says. So if a life coach says, I'm curious about, AI says it can be interpreted in lots of ways. So AI talks about exploration of thoughts. So that the coach is encouraging the client to explore their thoughts and feelings more deeply. So interested in understanding their perspective and maybe uncovering underlying beliefs or motivations that the client hasn't yet articulated. And then just as it was noted by a non-coach, AI says it's about a non-judgmental inquiry. So being curious, I'm curious about, suggests that the coach is open and interested in understanding the client's experience without imposing their own opinions. I think that's really critical. It also talks about prompting for reflection. So I'm curious about being a bit of a nudge for the client to reflect on a particular aspect of their life or behavior that they haven't yet considered closely. So guidance to kind of think about something from a different angle. AI also suggests that I'm curious about is an invitation to dialogue, so a deeper conversation, a signal that the coach wants to understand the situation better or more effectively, focusing very much on the client's needs. This one feels more obvious. So AI says it's about clarification, so needing more detail, encouraging the client to better understand their thought processes, their emotional states. And overall, AI says this phrase is a way for the coach to express interest and engage the client in meaningful self-exploration. Okay, let's now look at second phrase, showing up. So in terms of context, my experience is that this is used when the coach is making agreements with the client about how the coaching sessions and the programs will run. It's sometimes known as contracting. So it's kind of setting out expectations, not simply literally in expectations of keeping the appointments, but also in being prepared, coming prepared, and being mentally present without distraction. I've also heard it used when the coach is exploring a state or an issue. So the coach might say, how might this show up for you? So my understanding of the meaning is that showing up refers essentially to your state mentally and emotionally. So how would you be? What would you be doing? What's your level of presence, your mental attendance to the conversation? Amber flags. Amber flags. For me, it's a relatively new and adopted phrase in coaching, possibly Americanized, possibly slang. You can probably hear from how I'm saying it that personally I don't find it especially relatable. And for a concrete thinker, I think it could be interpreted literally as sort of how you arrive, equivalent to what I kind of slangly use as rocking up, which to me seems a bit random and unplanned and without intention. And that's quite the opposite to how I believe it's intended in a coaching context. So alternatives. So instead of, in place of, how might that show up for you? I think you could simply say, what might you be experiencing? What would be happening? The comments. One person said, I've got no objection to it. I would take that literally. Another person said, what, to the pub? Not appropriate in conversation. And the third person said, I really like this. Showing up matters to me. Now, in terms of AI, how might a showing up be interpreted? AI says in several ways. So it definitely relates to personal accountability. So the coach is asking the client to think about how they can take responsibility for their actions or behaviors or attitudes in a particular situation. So to kind of reflect on how you want to present yourself and engage with the world. It also talks about something called intentional presence. So encouraging the client to be more present and intentional in their interactions in coaching, in the coaching conversation. So, and it's about deciding to have a level of energy or mindset that you want to bring to a situation. The next two that AI suggests I can't quite relate to myself, but it's about, they say, about aligning your actions with your values, an opportunity to think about how you can embody the qualities or principles that are important to you in specific situations. And then it also talks about asking you to think about your role in situations. So recognizing the influence that you have and how you might want to contribute or respond, whether you're in interaction with an individual or with a group. AI definitely concurs with our previous thinking about preparation and mindset. So how you prepare yourself mentally and emotionally for a challenge or an opportunity in that coaching conversation. And it might be about visualizing or planning how you want to show up to get the best outcome. Interestingly, AI talks about empowerment and how you might want to take ownership of your identity and the impact of you on others. So how you want to be perceived, but interestingly, particularly in social media context, the legacy that you want to create. So how you want to show up on social media. So in essence, AI says, how might you show up is a prompt for you to consciously consider and choose the way you engage with life, whether in specific situations, that might be in the coaching conversation, or more broadly. It encourages intentionality, self-awareness, and alignment with your goals and values. Okay, so lastly, last phrase, holding space for. So the context here, holding space might be the way that a coach describes their responsibility, their intentions, their role in relation to the client. In terms of meaning, my take on it is that it refers to the coach keeping a level and quality of attention to the client. It also refers to something called psychological safety that's used more commonly now. So providing all the elements of conversational environment that enable the client to feel safe so that they can freely express themselves, they can freely share their thoughts and ideas and feelings relatively comfortably in that coaching conversation. And the flags. So I just think this phrase is so wide and nebulous, especially for concrete thinkers. And as if you are a concrete thinker, it might just be heard literally as the coach is holding an appointment for you, holding space, keeping that appointment available for you. So instead of holding space, in terms of alternatives, the coach might instead say something like, my attention and my thinking's focused entirely on you. And though you've got responsibility to kind of keep your own self safe, as coach, I'll do everything possible to make this a conversation in which you're able to disclose as much or as little as you prefer. So this is really commonly said, you're in control of the content of this conversation, and I'm interested in enabling you to take the time of the appointment to think and feel and experience and plan, ultimately to achieve what you want to achieve, ethically, of course. So comments in relation to that last phrase, holding space. One person said, this one has always sounded a bit poncy to me. Like, what does it actually mean? And it can come across just as quite highbrow especially when people might be feeling like they're in crisis. Somebody else said, it could mean anything. It needs to be really specific for people to understand. It needs to be clear and simple. And a third person said, I was talking to a friend who talked about holding a person through a trauma, and I was moved by that. I'm not sure about holding space, but the idea of being held or holding someone, I think, is powerful and very moving. It reminds me of that footprints in the sand analogy. And then AI says that it's very much about emotional support. So just as I was talking about psychological safety, the coach is offering a safe and non-judgmental environment where the client, can express their thoughts and feelings freely, and allowing the client to process whatever they're experiencing without fear of criticism. That's really important. It also has underneath it active listening. So it's a way of the coach indicating that they are fully present and listening to you or listening to the client with empathy and understanding. They're creating a space, a kind of metaphorical space where the client can be heard and validated and ensure that all of their concerns and experiences are acknowledged. It's also about non-interference. So it allows the coach to let you know that you have the time and space and think and reflect without entirely with your own conclusions. So you're not being rushed, you're not being given solutions, but you're being given the room or the space to come to your own conclusions as a client. Then this next one that AI talks about, I love this phrase. This is compassionate presence. So here the coach is offering their presence in a compassionate way. So they're there with the client in their journey, sharing the moment without imposing their own agenda or expectations. I really like that one. AI talks also about creating a nurturing environment where transformation can occur, a kind of a supportive backdrop to personal development. And in addition, it talks about respecting the process. So there's something in that about recognizing that each client takes their own time. Growth and change takes time and individually and very differently. And that the coach is willing to stand by the client throughout that journey. So overall, AI says, I'm holding space for you as a phrase, is an assurance that the coach is there for you or for the client in a supportive, patient and non-judgmental way, allowing the client to navigate their thoughts and feelings and experiences at their own pace. I really like that statement. It kind of makes me love the phrase a little bit more. Just a general comment from one of the non-coaches to all of the phrases, actually. They said that not in coaching, but in a other therapeutic setting, they agreed with the facilitator, with the therapist, that they wouldn't use cliches because that wound her up. And for her, it made the person feel far less relatable because she wouldn't say hold space in the real world, and it kind of made her feel, the therapist felt out of touch with her. So there we are. We've interrogated some very specific terminology used by coaches, including the views of non-coaches and a response from AI. And I'd be really interested, truly interested to hear your views about and responses to those three phrases. So as has become a bit of a pattern on these episodes, I'll finish here on 3 questions. So if you're a coach, what responses have you experienced from clients to professional coaching language and jargon? If you are a client, to what degree does it matter, if at all, that the coach uses professional language and jargon? And my always for this episode question, what am I missing? What else? So next week on a shorter podcast, with the help of fellow coaches, I'll start to review guidance from a range of sources on how to avoid coaching language or jargon. So here we've come to the end. Please share the episode, subscribe if you've enjoyed it, and tell me what you want to hear more about in 2020 Coaching Convos. Passionately Curious with me, Julie Crabb. Till next time.